Early China. So, as we usually do, we're going to start with a little talking about geography because that explains why people settle where they do. So, like the early ancient civilizations we've been talking about, Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, in China, they also developed along large rivers just a few hundred years later. So, the first one I'd like to talk about is Huanghe, which means yellow river. It gets its name from the soil as the river, took the soil with it, and there was this rich, really great for farming, less they call it, which is had a cast a yellowish color. So that's why they named the river after it. And so people settle here because, like I said, that soil is going to be great for farming. And so it was really good and made them a great wheat producing area. The only problem is it did flood sometimes. And so this river also has the nickname of China's Sorrow because it was so destructive and so many people have been killed over the years with the flooding. And then over time, people moved to another river system and they settled around the Changjiang, which is, or Yangtze River. Yangtze is also what people call it. And this is also going to be really good for farming. There are big rice growing in this area. And of course, it's going to help with transportation and trade, like we've talked about so often, right? Especially if they go out to the oceans. Okay. All right. So it makes sense that that's where they're going to grow, live in China. Also, you should know that the land itself is there's not that much of it that is actually great for farming. Only about a tenth of China is farmable because there are so many mountains and deserts. If you look at the map, you can see that. You do see terraced farming because they're trying to, deal with the mountainous region. And because they were kind of surrounded, if you look at the map, it's almost like they're walls, the mountains and the deserts, blocking them in from the other outside places. And because of that, they're going to develop their own unique culture, having been largely left alone for quite a long time, and be very independent from the other areas. In fact, they even called their land the Middle Kingdom, thinking like they were the center of the world. Okay, so the start of government. So there's a myth that many people in China perpetuate of what the first dynasty is, although there isn't historical evidence for this, but it is widely known. So the Yu the Great was this figure here is supposed to be representing. He supposedly chased away the dragon that was causing the flooding of the Huanghe, and he had other dragons help him to solve the flooding by digging channels out to control the flood waters, and it took them 13 years, and then they did it, and so he's held up as this like hero, and supposedly he was the founder of the first dynasty, the Xia. But even though that, the story goes that this one was the first dynasty around 2000 BC, we don't have any historical evidence for that. So historians don't count this as the first one. They count it as a myth. And the first one is the Shang dynasty. And so as you can imagine, this dynasty is going to develop similarly to we've talked about before. There's evidence for sure of these with walls and buildings and cities growing up in this area. Archaeologists have found. And so kings are going to, get control of a kingdom, and then eventually they get bigger and branch out. The king is the all political, religious, military leader, and it's very similar to other places. There's a palace in the center, and then the temple, and public buildings surrounding that, and then homes for government officials and everything around that. And then, of course, it goes out from there with workshops and other homes. And then, of course, the farmers, which is the majority of people, are going to be out in the more rural areas. Okay. So the kingdoms would have started smaller, but then, like I said, they're going to send out armies to defend the borders and maybe start getting their kingdom larger. So what the king would do is he would have these aristocrats that were called warlords, and these people had their own army, and they were sent out to like defend, a portion of the kingdom and their borders. And so they had a lot of power. They're kind of, you've probably heard of a warlord, kind of. The king was, of course, overseeing everyone, but within their area, they would have quite a bit of power. So it's kind of like they're like a little mini king, right? So these aristocrats, meaning that they were given, this power was given to people of noble birth, so they're wealthy, and they have this, this family would be rewarded time over time, right? So they would pass the power down to their sons, and the land that they've been given by the king, right, is their wealth. That's where their wealth comes from, okay? And so this powerful families would stay in control. And so the farmers would live in these rural villages and work the land for the rich aristocrats. So it's a very similar system to other areas we've talked about. And of course, there would be merchants and artisans and slaves and other smaller groups too. All right, and then also religiously, kind of similar. They believed in many gods. They did have one like supreme god that kind of was overseeing the other ones, Shang-Ti. And but the other interesting thing about the religion in China was that honoring your ancestors was equally as important. So not only would they bring offerings to the gods, and of course they thought the gods, like at the time, right? If you please the gods, they will make sure that you do well, right? And they also feared their gods, and they thought their gods lived in nature, so in the rivers, in the seas, in the mountains. But they also thought that their ancestors, right, the people in your family who have lived before you, could also bring you good luck or help you in times of trouble if you always were showing your respect and bringing them offerings. And this is still a thing that is sometimes still done in China, that today though they would burn like little small paper copies of food or clothing and things that they would maybe need like in the afterlife, right? And so they're giving them, but today it's more representing instead of actually burning the real items. Okay. And that's why did you ever see in that movie, I forgot the name of the dragon in Mulan, where they're that's how they're talking to the ancestors? Do you remember that? Okay, anyway. So kings also believed that it was very important to please the gods and get this wisdom from their ancestors too. So what they would do is they would go to the priests and they would talk to their ancestors through something called oracle bones, okay? And basically the priests would scratch like a question onto the bone, and then it would be burned over the fire, and then how it cracked would make tell the answer, supposedly. So they'd ask things like, will I win the battle, or will we have a good harvest? And so the cracking pattern would supposedly tell the priests what the answer was. Okay, and so they thought they were talking to their ancestors. Now, speaking of writing, the writing is different. There are a lot of Chinese characters, and unlike English, it's not based on alphabetic sounds, right? They're actual characters that represents like objects. So a pictograph is like, for instance, the sun. The word sun is like a picture of the sun. But then also things that are more complex, then they might have to combine pictographs. So like then it becomes called an ideograph. So they give you an example here with tree. Tree would be a pictograph, but then if you want to have a more complex idea like woods or forest, you'd add extra trees, right? So you can see how the characters are kind of linked together to form a new idea. Okay, it's much more complicated and there are lots of them. But anyway, so that's the kind of really basic idea. All right, also we should talk about the arts during the Shang Dynasty. So bronze, very, very impressive bronze, still surviving today. Sculptures and daggers and vases and lots of different things. They had these beautiful urns. Urn, I think you think of probably an urn as like you put your ashes of your dead family member in an urn, which may be true. But the urn itself just means some kind of ceremonial container. And in this case, back in these times, they would use it for like honoring their ancestor, bringing the food and for their ancestors. Also, a major thing for the Chinese was silk. They figured out how to make it, weave it from silkworms. I have a video to show you about that. And of course, it took very time consuming and hard to do. And so it was very expensive. So only the wealthy could afford, right, this beautiful clothing, very colorful, made out of silk. And it became very popular trading item. And they found it in faraway places, like as far as like Greece. Okay. Another thing that you may have heard of or seen is we call it china today, but it's made from a fine white clay called kaolin. And so the dishes, there's that white, we call it china. And of course, that's, named after the place where they got it from, right? So it's interesting that nowadays we call that. And then, but of course, it isn't just plates, right? There's like beautiful vases and things. And then also ivory and jade that would make beautiful statues and jewelry and things. And if you go to China, you will often find a lot of jade. It's a thing to buy when you're in China. Okay. So supposedly, according to legend, the last Shang ruler was a terrible person, a wicked tyrant. And so many people started turning against him. And so credit goes to this guy, Wu Wang, who was an aristocrat. He led people to overthrow the Shang government. And so this is around 1045 BC. And he similar to, rules it very similarly to how it's been ruled. It ends up being a very successful dynasty. Oh, his dynasty is called the Zhou dynasty. I know that sounds kind of like a J, at least when I say it, but it starts with a Z, so that part of the challenge for this chapter is getting to understand which words I'm talking about based on the pronunciation. Might not look quite the same. Okay, so the king is going to have an army, and they're going to, again, try to, make a bigger kingdom. And so this dynasty gets quite large, much larger than before. And the king decides that the kingdom's getting very large to manage, so he breaks it into territories, and he has loyal aristocrats even, rule the different territories. And again, usually that is given to, right, someone who is loyal and their family is already aristocrat, and it's passed down through the family. It's hereditary positions, meaning your son would have the job after you of ruling that territory. Okay, and then the other thing that's interesting during the Zhou dynasty is that this idea of mandate of heaven. They believed that the king had the right to rule because the gods had chosen him. And so that's great, But then there was also in this idea during this dynasty that there was a certain way that the king was supposed to rule. He was supposed to make sure he honored the gods. And because, um, it was so important for the king to also be doing the right thing, they took it as a sign. If, for example, there's a natural disaster or some kind of bad harvest, that's a sign that the gods aren't happy, and therefore you could lose your mandate, right? You could be replaced because you must not be making the gods happy in what you're doing. Okay, so that's kind of a new idea. All right. The Zhou dynasty also had quite a bit of technology. One of the major things is this idea of not just relying on rain, that you can actually build irrigation systems, and they do that, and they, of course, will have more crops. And as you know, the more crops you have, then you end up expanding your trade, right? And everything was good for a while, but then in around the 400s-ish BC, people start, like the aristocrats, I should say, start ignoring the king's commands and like really controlling the territory for themselves, and they start fighting other aristocrats and trying to get more power for themselves. And so they call it the period of warring states. And so for about 200 years, there's kind of this chaos of fighting amongst themselves. And it is during this long period of fighting that we do see some advancements also in fighting instruments. Of course, we had, so the soldiers had swords and spears and crossbows, but once horses are put into the mix, then they realize that, it's kind of hard to, ride on your horse and still use your crossbow, for example. So they developed a saddle and a stirrup. And so this is, the Chinese are given the credit for this invention, right? And if you can kind of steady yourself and, even like stand up a little bit on your stirrups, then you're going to be able to shoot while you're riding your horse. And so that's going to kind of, change warfare. All right, and we'll talk about what happens after the Zhou dynasty, after the period of warring states next time.